Afternoon. Many guests travel many hours of time difference to be here today. For some of you, it is actually 3 o'clock in the morning in China. So if you're feeling a little tired, that's very understandable. My name is Ann Sui. My Chinese name is Xu, which is the Sui, T-S-U-I, is a Hong Kong spelling, so that tells you a little bit of my background. I was born in China, and I went to Hong Kong when I was 10 years old, illegally. And then when I was 21, I moved to the United States to be a student legally. So I was one time an illegal alien and one time a legal alien. And I'm a fully American with an American passport, and I feel very fortunate for that. My former title is the Motorola Professor of International Management. And my involvement with China actually was quite accidental. Even though I am Chinese, I have not done many Chinese studies in the early stages of my career. I'm very much a full-blown traditional American researcher, studying American problems and learning American theories and American research methods. And I'm very much a research scholar and with very little, some work experience. So I look at the whole conference experience and my contribution to China's development from a research point of view. And so my involvement in China has been since 1995. I went to Hong Kong University of Science and Technology as a management professor, department head, helped build a management department at the university. It is at that time I realized China is coming of age. China was developing its business school very rapidly, and it's, of course, the economic environment is vibrant and so forth. But I noticed also that all business schools are teaching American management practices, American business models. And so there was not a whole lot of research about Chinese companies or about multinational companies in China. And I felt there's a need for more research, so I formed with a group of colleagues an association called International Association for Chinese Management Research, and I started a new journal called Management Organization Review. We have copies on the desk, and I know it's all gone. So if you have a copy of that journal, this is our contribution to China's business development, because that journal publishes the best, most current research about Chinese management, about management in China, about business models. But I have to confess that we have not found the Chinese business model yet. And we are still trying to figure out, from a research point of view, what are the success practices, what are the success factors for business in China, both by Chinese firms and multinational corporations alike. So today, this morning, we've had 3 excellent panels. We started with entrepreneurs sharing their stories, successful stories of building their business in China. In that discussion, we also talked about some challenges as well. And then this afternoon, the panel we just had, we talked a little bit about China's opportunities and so forth. And it's been mentioned at lunch as well that the major challenges can be summarized into 2. One is people, and the second is the government. Okay. So today, this afternoon's session, in fact, is going to focus on Chinese business environment, and a big part of it is going to be the legal environment. We have 2 legal scholars on the panel, 1 political scientist, and an expert on supply chain management. As you know, supply chain is a big problem in China with subcontracting, and that's a very serious problem in terms of how to ensure quality, how to ensure delivery, and so forth. So our expert in supply chain management will help us gain some insight into that. Okay. So China is known as the land with the rule of man, a woman, but not the rule of law. And the last panel has mentioned that's not really actually true. China is developing very well-defined legal code, even though you may argue some of which is ambiguously written, some of which was poorly enforced, but it has a developing legal code, cover many aspects of the business environment. So eventually, we suspect that the legal environment for all kinds of firms will be similar in a sense that state-owned private companies in China and multinational companies in China will all face the same legal environment, which has not been the case for the last 30 years. And part of it is because of the WTO requirement, partly is because China's own trajectory, own path of development. All right, with that, then I will turn to the panel without much further ado in terms of time. So what I'd like to do is I would give a brief introduction of 4 panelists, and I ask each one of them to share with you what they have prepared in terms of formal remarks, all within 10 minutes. And I've been instructed by Scott to wave and dance and sing or jump on the table if they reach 8 minutes, so that they'll know to wrap up their formal presentation. And our hope is that we will have a few minutes for some questions from the audience. I know it is very demanding to have you sit there for so many, such a long time after a good lunch. But you will. I think you'll find this panel to have a lot of wisdom to share with you, because they're in the sort of on the ground level. They work with lots of clients, and they do lots of research, and they can share with you what is China's current legal environment and what are the promises and future positive developments. So the first one is Angella Castille, and she's a lawyer. She's currently the vice chair of the international practices of Baker and Daniels. And she has consulted many companies, and especially for companies operating in China. And she's an expertise in many areas in terms of joint ventures, setting up joint ventures, foreign subsidiaries, contracts, and licensing, and so forth. So she will bring to you her experience and her learning from her clients that she has worked with over the years. And the second speaker is going to be Professor Zhao, going in that order, Professor Xiande. He is a professor of operations management at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Is a very good partner to Indiana University as well. As I mentioned, he is an expert in supply chain management, and he will share with you his experience in that respect. And the third speaker will be Scott. You want Professor Li will be the third one. Li Youxing. Professor Li is also vice dean of the Guanghua School of Law at Zhejiang University. So clearly he's a legal scholar. He's a lawyer in practice as well as an arbitrator. And he's very involved in many of these societies involving the business law sector. Right? So last but not least, Scott does not need any introduction. So we save that 1 minute of introduction for your presentation later. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming the 4 speakers and beginning with Angella. Okay.
Good afternoon. I feel I should ask everyone to stand up and stretch because I know how exhausted everybody must be. My name is Angella Castille. I'm a partner with Baker & Daniels, and I've been working there for quite some time, I guess 16 years. I was trying to think back how long it's been. I'm actually started working with our China practice back in 1998. It's kind of a comical story. My background is actually in German law. I went to law school in Germany, came to the United States and finished my law degree here, and began working with Baker & Daniels, and was approached by the China team to get involved with the China team. And I said, I don't really know any Mandarin. I don't really know much about Chinese law. They said, yeah, but you speak another language, and we figure you can wing it from there. So that's kind of the story of how I got involved, and I've been involved with the practice ever since. It's my great privilege to work with a lot of different folks, not just in Indiana, but in lots of other states. But my privilege is to be a part of the business team that helps them to globalize and stretch out to other locations. And China is probably the most challenging for a number of different reasons. And, let me just say my strong suit is not creativity. So when I put together this little thought piece, I gripped back to David Letterman and said, what are the top 10 reasons why it's a challenge to do business in China, and came up with this list. Based solely on the totally unscientific method, which was to go back through emails over the past year and say, what have my clients been emailing me about over the past year, and what have their concerns been, and that's kind of how I came to this list. I'm pleased to say that it coincides in great part to the very scientific study that AmCham did, according to our luncheon speaker, and it looks like I'm hearing some of the same things that the AmCham populace is voicing, so that's kind of reassuring to know. let me talk just a little bit about doing business in China and what that means. I think the first thing that it means from clients' perspective is commitment. And I say that because the fundamental premise of the business system in China is really not that the Chinese government wants to throw its arms to the entire world and say, please come and invest with us, but rather that the fundamental premise is, let us take a look to see how your project fits with our plans, and if you're going to be profitable and it will benefit us, then we're throwing our arms open to you to come. And so that's a really different attitude to start out from than what you will find in many other systems, including the United States. And for that reason, I think it makes for a totally different premise. So the first things that I wanted to talk about, and I think Kelley talked about this earlier, and I was pleased to hear him speak about the fact that the legal system is really, it's a challenge, and it's if you're trying to sort of take our legal system and take your contracts and do business the same way in China that you do here, you're really going to struggle. And let me just also say that with respect to his comment about the rule of law, that's really a defined legal term. And I think many of the struggles that we have is because how we as Americans and the Western system thinks of the rule of law is not exactly the same thing as what you see in China. And so there is a real disconnect there. So let me talk about the number 10, enforcement of contracts, and I'll talk about the court system together. Contracts in China are really not the same as they are here in the sense that they are a jumping off point for most business transactions. That is to say, they're a starting point for a negotiation, whereas in the US, we look at a contract and say, pacta sunt servanda. In other words, you must enforce what the contract says. I think the biggest frustration I hear clients tell me about is the fact that the contract starts as the base negotiation point from which there will be multiple amendments and derivations. And that, for them, is a totally different cultural phenomenon, and it's very frustrating. So that's one piece. The enforcement of those obligations is the second piece that goes in with the court system. In the United States, we really tend to give a lot of credence to our courts and to the reliability and predictability of judgments. That is really not the case in China. I'm not saying there haven't been great improvements, and there have. There have been fabulous improvements. But we still don't have concepts of stare decisis, meaning that the decision of a court is binding in other jurisdictions throughout China. And so we also don't have the same culture of looking at court decisions and saying, well, if a judge in Shanghai says this, then maybe a judge in Guangzhou can say the same thing. And so it makes it very difficult from a business perspective to plan based on what a predictable court will say. The second piece is there's still a lot of political appointments throughout the judiciary, and so it makes it really tough to figure out whether or not someone is going to understand all of the legal premises that you're building your argument upon. That's difficult. Is that changing? Yes, and there's been incredible changes to, I think, the Chinese judiciary and the Chinese bar in the last 20 years. It's really pretty fascinating. But that's something that's in evolution and really contributes to the frustration of foreign investors who come in and think about China and say, well, okay, if someone breaches the contract, we're going to go to court and we're going to get an injunction. Well, mostly you can't get injunctions in China. And mostly your remedies need to be rethought more in terms of self-help than in terms of the coercive power of a court. So let me come into point number 8 and talk about cultural issues and systemic corruption. And I say this, somebody talked about culture. I think it might have been Dan Brendel. It was a really good point, which is that the Chinese culture really informs the way that you think about corruption and think about some of the problems. I mean, gifting is an integral part of how people live together there and how they do business. And so to deny the fact that gifting goes on is to really not understand at all what's going on in that country. That said, as a U.S. company coming into this culture, our challenge is that we don't become so involved in that culture that we violate U.S. laws that have application in other countries, including in China. And so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for many U.S. companies that have U.S. management directly involved in China, it poses a really, difficult and competitive problem because they see many other foreign investors who aren't worrying so much about things like gifting and bribery. And so it is a real challenge for U.S. companies to be in China where gifting and kickbacks are part of the business culture, and try to figure out how do they navigate that in a way that will keep their executives, out of jail, I guess. As sort of a next thing that I hear from my clients a lot, it's quality control, and it manifests itself on a lot of different levels. The quality control piece, everybody knows that you have to be more competitive on a pricing level, but where that tends to play out tends to be in the quality control. So if quality is poor, it usually is because suppliers are trying to reduce costs so they can be more competitive. And as a consequence, what I hear from our client base at least is that they're having to spend more money on making sure that the quality standards are met. Oftentimes what it means is that they're having to go to China to create their own vehicle for doing quality control for products that are produced there. Other times it means that they're having to do much more training and investment in some of the Chinese suppliers that they're working with. And oftentimes on their own people, training for their own people who are on the ground in China. A quick word about quality control and corruption. I think for a lot of companies, there's a certain amount of frustration in the way that corruption plays into some of the approval and licensing processes. I've had clients tell me, gosh, if we weren't a U.S.-owned company, it'd be a lot faster to get some of these approvals through. And there's really not a lot of solace that you can offer someone who says that based upon our legal system. I also think that some of the headlines that we have heard in the past 2 years, for example, the head of the SFDA who was executed because that person was selling product approvals, those things have ways of really, trickling down and having influence much farther along into the process. The top 5 issues that I would talk about, and I see I only have 2 minutes left, so I guess I've already been verbose. The top 5 issues I'd talk about are finding qualified management, and by that I mean innovative folks who are working with you and trying to think with you the same way about strategic objectives. Capital, getting it in, taking it out, really being able to enjoy it, and navigating China's incredibly complicated foreign exchange system. And then employment issues. I think of all the things that have been really challenging, layoffs in a down economy and some of the problems that have been attendant to implementing the new labor contract law have really played out on this sector. And then I would have to say time. Time is money in the United States. Time is money in China too, but the time that you're spending is your time trying to understand their system. So I would say those are the most challenging things. I would never take IPR protection off the list. I think it's a huge issue on many different levels, but I also think it's a topic everybody knows about. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, you want to go here?
Yeah.
Okay. Here you go.
I need to collaborate with him, just like in supply chain collaboration. Yeah, it's an honor for me to speak over here. I work for Chinese University of Hong Kong. In recent years, with the generous support from Li and Feng Group, we've conducted a number of quality management, supply chain management related projects. While we are doing these projects, all these product recall issues come out. So we said we'd better combine quality management with supply chain management. So we do research on the so-called supply chain quality management. So when I look at this long list of challenges and obstacles to business corporations we need to address. Naturally, I pick supply chain management difficulties. I think one of the huge challenges that facing most business these days is related to product quality. First of all, you have to make sure that you are going to produce good quality products. That means no defective, but sometimes that is very difficult to do. Okay? So secondly, if you do have defectives, you need to make sure you will handle that properly so that it's not going to turn into product harm crisis. And thirdly, if you did not do that very well, you do have a product harm crisis to handle, you'd better handle that right so that your company will not go bankrupt. That's really a life and death situation. A lot of companies actually do get bankrupt very quickly, and they become really $0 worth in the stock market from really huge capitalization. So if you look at some of the news headlines, you're going to find some people find in the first half of 2007, 104 of the 155 consumer products recalled were made in China. That's based on the US number. And then in 2008, 86 consumer products recalled in the UK. Okay? 62 of these were made in China. And then I also pull out some more statistics. If you look at this line, this is really alarming, right? So starting from 2004, the percentage of toys recalled that are made in China increased to like over 80%, and then it stayed around 80%. So the question is, are the Chinese-made products really bad? Everybody is saying they are really bad. But there can be another answer, which is you're buying too many products from China. Yeah? So if you look at the next chart, what you find is US import 90% toys. Out of that 90%, 86% are made in China. So if you multiply those two, what is the result? It's 77 point something, and that's the value. And then in terms of the number of units, you would find you are buying more than 80% units from manufacturers in China. So from that perspective, okay, even though you hear about all these stories about China-made products are bad, actually, in terms of proportion, they are not really higher. Okay? But that does not mean we do not have problems. We still need to improve. So we basically went to one of the towns in Shantou where there is a huge cluster of toy manufacturers. And then we interviewed them. We visited their factory. We also talked to government officials. We also talked to some of the consultants who work with them a lot. And then our basic objective is to find out why we have all these quality problems. Okay? So from their perspective, we made a long list of problems they encounter. First, they say many of the times you do not know what do the customer wants and what is the US regulation, what is the European regulation, because many of these manufacturers are very small and they are sitting far, far away from the market, from the customer, and they rely on their customers to tell them, but some of their customers are really small importers and distributors, and they go there and say, we want product which will have to satisfy the European requirement, the US requirement, but the manufacturers say, tell me what is the requirement, then I can make that for you. Then the distributor say, I do not know, you are the manufacturer, you are supposed to know it. So towards the end, they make products without knowing what is really the exact requirement. And in addition to that, sometimes they produced and designed the product for country A, and then some people bought it, and then they imported that to country B or country C. And it happens country B and C had different regulation and different requirements, so in the end, they are in deep trouble. So one of the huge problems we encounter is most of these manufacturers do not really have enough knowledge of the consumers' needs and wants and the regulations in the marketplace. They need to work with strong partners as their customer. But many of the times, they do not really have a very strong integration, do not really have a high level of commitment and high level of relationship with the customer. So that's one of the major causes of the problem. Now, when you look at, let's say, the upstream in terms of how do you do purchasing, how do you manage the supplier relationship, one of the things they keep on telling us is these European big buyers, US big buyers, they keep on squeeze us on the price. And they want the so-called US quality, European quality, but they want to pay the so-called Shanghai price. Shanghai is the town in which we interviewed these manufacturers. And because they really needed work, so they are going to compete with each other to win the order. And we've seen stories where two companies compete with each other, then within 2 days, they cut the price in half. But once the price is cut in half, what can they do? Then they get all the suppliers together, and then they figure out a way to reduce quality without violating what you have specified in the contract. So they end up with having creative ways to change the material they use so that they can give you the product. But once you get the product, you start to find the product doesn't really function that well. And many of the times, that's the leading reason for the recall. Now, another major reason is sometimes in a rush to get your production order filled, you use unknown supplier. In the case of the toy manufacturer, who really had a huge recall recently, it's just someone in Dongguan who sold color pigment that they use in the paint. And that paint actually is only used in the eyeball of that toy. So you can imagine how much will that component of this product cost. Very little, maybe less than 1 cent. But then they cheated, and then they did not satisfy the environmental regulation, but they had fake certificate. And then in the end, it caused the entire recall. So we need to work hard and build the relationship and have adequate communication and try to choose suppliers who have the technical capability, who are trustworthy, who will not really have opportunistic behavior. So that's something which is very important. Otherwise, they can kill you. And then another thing, of course, is your internal system. And then that's something most of the companies have worked on already. So even though we find problems in those areas, that's not surprising. But more importantly, even though companies have been talking about total quality management for years, but many of the times, if you look at things from the supply chain perspective, often within supply chain, there's no leadership. And they do not really pay attention to things like business ethics and consideration for safety and environment. And also, sometimes they do not pay too much attention to the social responsibilities of the company in the supply chain. And then, towards the end, if you will have to put in quality control and inspection on every step as a way to prevent problem, rather than you have selected partners who have certain business value and ethics, then you're going to find your job in managing the supply chain will be extremely difficult or impossible. Another thing is we found, even though in the US, in Europe, we keep on talking about recalls or product made in China. But in China, among all the manufacturers we talked to, none of them really had a recall system because they never even experienced the recall. Okay, that's in China. Okay, so that's another issue. So there is no really consciousness on this issue of product recall. And then, in order for you to really do well, prevent all these different things through our interview with these different companies, we are proposing a supply chain quality management model, which will include the internal system we used to talk about, which is this bottom one, and then supplier selection, supplier evaluation, supplier development, supplier process monitoring, product analysis. Those things, even though some companies need to pay attention to, but many of them are still doing it. But more importantly, do you have a product recall system? Many companies actually don't have it. And then, do you really have business ethics and social responsibility really formally introduced in your supply chain system? Many supply chains do not have that formally. And then another component which is missing is downstream partner selection and integration. You do not only have to select your supplier, work with them, develop the partnership, you have to selectively choose who are your customer. They have to work with you in order for you to be able to prevent supply chain problems. That's basically all I have to share with you, and thank you very much.
All right, now next is Professor Li.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. In order to correctly express my view, I will speak in Chinese. 我的题目叫中美商务合作机遇胜于障碍。商务合作需要平等、诚信和有效法律规则的条件。中美两国已有的法律制度可以满足双方商务投资、商务合作，尤其在中国，近年来大规模的为适应市场经济的立法，为商务合作提供了巨大的机遇。
My topic today is U.S.-China business cooperation. Business cooperation needs to be equal, integrity. In U.S. and China, for the recent years, both countries have established a legal system that can foster. Both countries has engaged in massive legislative practice. In my opinion, the U.S. and China's current legal system can satisfy the need of equal and integrity of the business cooperation.
中国已经构建了较为完整的企业商务合作立法，一、承认多种形式的商事组织形式，在中国投资可以是中外合资经营、中外合作经营、外商独资，可以是有限公司、股份公司、有限合伙企业。中国公司的最低注册资本已经价为3万元人民币。
China has a relatively comprehensive business cooperation law system. China recognizes a variety kinds of commercial organizations, include solo practice, foreign China joint venture corporations, and partnership companies. The lowest registration capital requirement required by Chinese law is now 80,000 renminbi, which is equal to $4,000 US.
二、市场准入的开放性。中国的投资项目分鼓励、限制和禁止，除涉及国家安全和公共利益项目，大部分产业均已开放，允许外资、外商投资，包括金融业、房地产等产业。
Second, the openness of market access in China. There are three categories of business projects which are encouraged, restricted, or prohibited.
三、鼓励企业购并。中国有大量的法律制度，便利企业家们收购兼并企业，可以通过股权购买、 资产购买实施收购兼并。国家还设有专门的并购杠杆贷款。
Chinese laws encourage merger and acquisition of enterprises. China has an established legal system in regulating merger and acquisition by means of capital purchase, enterprise merge, etc.
是鼓励创业企业的风险投资。就这样。
4. Encourage venture investment.
5. 税收企业所得税自2008年1月1日起，企业所得税均为中外资企业均为25%。
5. The consistency of all taxes. Start from January 1st, 2008. All companies are paying 25% taxes, regardless of their nationality, include domestic and foreign companies.
6. 外汇自由兑换经常性项目实行自由兑换。
6. Free exchange of foreign currency.
中国是一个潜力无穷的新兴市场经济国家，国家为法治化的市场经济做了不断完善的立法，包括在知识产权保护、投资的国民待遇等等方面。
China is a country of great potential. China has perfect its legal system, include in intellectual property protection, provide non-discrimination treatment to foreign companies.
当然，中美商务合作的障碍也是客观存在的。
Of course, the obstacles of business cooperation is also a fact.
一，主权国家都有自己独立的这个外资政策、商事立法法律制度的存在巨大差异。
Every country has its independent legislation in business foreign investment. The legal system differ widely.
各国法律制度本身都是为了鼓励投资、鼓励商务合作，但由于法律制度的复杂性，尤其对法律制度认识的误解以及了解的不全面，人为发生的障碍，需要相互交流、相互理解，克服障碍。
Every country tries to encourage investment and business cooperation, but because of the complexity of the system and because of misunderstandings appear in practice, it is important to develop mutual understanding and communication between China and U.S.
二，主权国家为本国利益而采取的投资市场准入的限制、非国民待遇、反倾销、反补贴、保障措施，知识产权保护标准的分歧，以及贸易保护主义，也会使合作带来障碍，需要合作双方共同努力克服。
Each country may create obstacles when enforcing policies to protect domestic investors such as anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, safeguard mechanism, and different standards in protecting intellectual property. Two countries, China and U.S., need to work together on solving those problems.
三，商事纠纷解决缺乏真正有效性决的途径，费用昂贵的解决方式也使合作产生障碍。
3. commercial disputes resolution is not effective. The costly resolution process also obstruct the business cooperation.
总之，中国需要有远见的企业家，中国也将给投资到中国的企业家以巨大的利润回报。中国法律制度可以完全保护这个双方商务合作双方的合法权益。
Overall, China is in need of more brilliant investors, and China is going to benefit those people who invest in China. China's legal system is good enough to protect all the investors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, the panel, so far for sticking to time. So, Scott, you're on. 10 minutes. Okay. You follow the same rule. You don't get any special favors just because you're organizer.
Thank you very much. Well, then I'm going to talk very quickly, and let's begin. I feel it's maybe a little unfair to Liu Xing because he was speaking with two people, but anyway, I appreciate that, and I'll do my best. I have a lot of slides, but I have a very simple message, and so at some point I may be whipping through slides. But if you just focus on me and the message, which is very straightforward, I'll do my best to keep within the time. Now, I want to focus on political obstacles and barriers to business cooperation between China, the United States, and China and all of its neighbors. And first, I want to say that, of course, yes, China does institute various type of barriers or obstacles that make it difficult for foreign companies that want to sell to China, that want to invest in China, from achieving their full potential. Obviously, and here is a list. I didn't know if I got my 10, but it's a pretty long list. Government procurement, which is directed at domestic firms, and China just announced its $4 trillion spending package, and most of that will go towards domestic companies. There are 10 industry development promotion plans that they've rolled out in the last couple months, and each of these are opportunities to support domestic industry primarily in the years ahead. The renminbi is, by many accounts, undervalued. I don't want to get into the legal debates about manipulation, as you could see. So, powerful renminbi, a weak dollar. Piracy, this is just software piracy data. You can see the proportion of pirated software installed on computers in China. It's still extremely high compared to that in the United States, in Japan. China also has begun to initiate its own anti-dumping investigations against others, accusing them of dumping in China. And China is now the third largest initiator of anti-dumping cases, and in these cases, the Chinese companies who feel threatened by foreign competition ask the Chinese government, the Ministry of Commerce, for relief. And we're now, this is just 141, I believe. We're up significantly higher in the second half of 2008 and early 2009 with a slew of cases. And what's very interesting about this is as you get more anti-dumping cases, you get more qualified international trade lawyers helping the Chinese. China has its own number of what I call international trade ambulance chasers who run up to Chinese companies after they've searched through the statistical yearbooks and go, look, you've been injured, let's sue. And these companies are quite active and aggressive, and unfortunately for some, they're doing a good job and good business. China also faces obstacles because of environmental standards acquired abroad. This is a picture, I don't know if you can see through the fog, and it's not fog, it's just pollution. This is the Beijing air. This is the typical Beijing air. The Olympic air was the fake air. I realized that because I arrived in the middle of the Olympic spring, and once October came, and I'm going back to that on Saturday. So I got to bring some oxygen with me, some good Indiana air. So they face environmental companies going to China face these type of problems. There's also the question of product safety issues, and of course, when things affect families, of course, this becomes even more important. Barbie dolls are sometimes more important than even than airplanes and other things. The Chinese also have, as of last August 1st, implemented their new anti-monopoly law, and this can be an obstacle to foreign acquisitions. And so, yes, as Liu-Xing pointed out, they have encouragement of mergers and acquisitions involving foreign companies. Just a few weeks ago, Coke's application to purchase the juice maker Huiyuan was denied on its anti-competitive consequences for the beverage industry. And depending on who you talk to, you get a different explanation for why this was denied. The Chinese on the Ministry of Commerce gives an explanation, although others talk about lobbying by Chinese companies who were going to be affected by this. And I've heard and talked to the lawyers of foreign companies, Coke's global competitors, who were opposed to the merger. And one of the ironies of this is that the company who suffered most in the wake of the failed merger attempt is Huiyuan. Its stock went off the chart, just collapsed 50% the day after the merger was rejected. Nevertheless, it is that these type of obstacles do exist. China also has, over the last 10 years, promoted the adoption of its distinctive technology standards, particularly in telecommunications. And there's a variety of ways, again, so this is a long list of things. But the Chinese also face obstacles going abroad. China is the largest target of anti-dumping investigations of anyone around the world, as Liu-Xing mentioned and we've heard before, and people may feel this is justified because of the pricing. But what's interesting about these cases is that when one is going to calculate the price of Chinese goods being sold abroad, you don't use the prices from China because China is considered a non-market economy, and therefore you use prices from India and elsewhere. Lin Langfang would mention that during his remarks this morning. Well, China may not be a full market economy according to the rules, but the methodology of using these other countries is simply a shortcut to finding China guilty, and that's in my own estimation, a relatively unfair way to do this. It may not be, China still may not be upholding its agreements, but I think two bads don't make a right. China also faces obstacles in the areas of its own in trying to go abroad. One of the reasons Don Lee pointed out that 90% of investment that Chinese make abroad are to the developing world. Well, they do face obstacles in investing in the United States and Europe. The U.S. has the CFIUS system, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S., and what that does is screens foreign investment for its potential threats to U.S. national security. And if you look at those rules, there's a long list of what one uses to judge whether something threatens national security. But in the actual implementation of those rules, there's a lot of flexibility and wiggle room. And that makes it very difficult for the Chinese to know when a investment will be approved or not. And over the past few years, they've had some rejected. And right now, they're really waiting on a big investment acquisition in Australia, where Chinalco, Chinese aluminum national company, is trying to purchase a large share of Rio Tinto. And I think that case will say a lot about the Chinese efforts to go abroad to advanced industrialized countries in the years ahead. Now, so we've got protection both at the Chinese Institute against others and the problems that they face abroad. If you put those two things together and take a broader picture, you can note that the WTO rules do promote low barriers to trade, and reciprocity. But there are numerous exceptions to the rules in the WTO that allow, under certain conditions, countries to do a lot of things to protect domestic industry. And countries have consistently tried to use those loopholes to their advantage. But in addition to that, there are many areas of global trade and finance that are not supported by strong international rules that promote openness. For example, I just discussed foreign investment. There are no clear rules internationally about what type of foreign investment should or should not be allowed. For example, defining what is a threat to national security or not. There's no rules about that. And most of international finance do not have those type of rules. So the lack of a consensus in these areas is a problem. And the economic crisis that we're in is the exception of all exceptions. And so you're likely to see more countries taking advantage of these rules or the lack of rules. And so what this means is, as the Prime Minister of Great Britain mentioned during the G20 summit, the Washington consensus is dead. But I think what we're left with no consensus, and when you don't have a consensus about the international rules, the opportunities for greater protectionism are quite high. Let me end, though, on a positive note, and that is there are strong bulwarks against increased protectionism. And that is globalization, which has been based on and strengthened common transnational interests. Just all of the trade and investment that has occurred has pluralized interests within countries like they have never been before. And all that foreign investment that's rushed into China, the $50 billion of Chinese investment that came out in 2008, promotes openness, the maintenance of openness. And so although China initiates a lot of anti-dumping cases, as this slide shows, over half of the time, foreigners who are sued in Chinese administrative proceedings actually don't entirely lose their cases, and that's surprising. And that's because you get domestic Chinese interests who support them, who lobby. It doesn't necessarily follow the nice rule of law, but the cases still end up that way. Chinese efforts to promote technical standards that are distinctive, that may hurt foreign interests, typically run into problems. And the Chinese standards that do well are the ones in which foreigners play a significant role. So, for example, in this case, IGRS, a very successful a Chinese standard which has a great chance of success, is supported by Lenovo, and Lenovo is working with major multinationals on this. All right. So the bulwark against protectionism is globalization and those companies which have developed common interests. And the companies in this room are the greatest bulwark against protectionism. Thank you very much.